It's now my singular privilege on behalf of the David Syme Business School to ask the Speaker for the night to address us at the inaugural Sir Philip Lynch Memorial Address. I give you, ladies and gentlemen, John Gough.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Deputy Premier, the Archbishop, and ladies and gentlemen. I feel particularly privileged to have been asked to speak to you tonight. Naturally, we're all delighted that you've honoured Sir Philip Lynch with this lecture. I first met Philip as a result of the Duke of Edinburgh Study Conference a number of years ago, which focused on industrialisation and the individual and the management of change. These are stimulating meetings, and the sixth such study conference has recently been completed in Australia, and I know how much he would have enjoyed it. Sir Philip was a dedicated internationalist. He achieved a great deal to open political and economic windows onto the wider benefits which Australia could gain by being a full member of the international trading community. This may seem a simple, rather self-evident statement, but during the 60s and 70s it took courage, commitment and vision to turn the entrenched commercial society of those days into one which could see that our future well-being lay in our ability to compete internationally. Sir Philip himself was a great competitor. He proved it many times in both his public and private life. It could not be more fitting that this lecture, sponsored by a leading Australian teaching institution, the David Syme Business School, should be in his honour. In this regard, I'd also like to say how pleased I am to see Lady Lynch and their son Philip here tonight. My theme is Australia's international business prospects. Rather than proceed into a broad discussion of all our international trade issues, I thought it'd be more useful to concentrate on the industrial and manufacturing aspects of our international trade. In recent years, there's been some discussion on manufacturing industry, particularly following the Jackson report. Then attention seemed to lapse, again as we appeared to believe, particularly guided by our bureaucrats and economists, that Australia had virtually no role for manufacturing industry. It is strange how things change. Today there is a growing realization that we need international sales, we need Australian international companies, and that we need a vigorous manufacturing industry. Income from the export of finished goods and technology is now one of Australia's greatest priorities. In recent weeks, there's been considerable debate on where our country is heading. For the first time for possibly 20 years, there is debate regarding our decline in comparative economic strength, and whether we face a long period of wealth decline or whether we're prepared as people to recognize how others see us, how others view our economy, and do something about it. Events of recent weeks have sharpened the focus on the matters I'd been preparing for this address. The key awakening has come from our inability in developing exports to pay for all the imports we've been consuming. The result of this increasingly serious gap is an ever-increasing borrowings to pay for our debt. Then we find we require increased interest rates to attract these borrowings, all compounding into an ever-deteriorating situation. Finally, others perceive our economic ills and force a currency devaluation. Then inevitably the standard of living declines with all the unpalatable problems this brings. I said earlier I propose to concentrate on one aspect, that of the internationalization of Australian business, and particularly manufacturing industry. But before doing so, I'd like to trace with you a little of the history of our problems. In recent years, there have been quite remarkable changes in world trading patterns. Those most affecting Australia have been the pressures on our traditional, efficiently produced rural products. These have been due to increased farming production throughout the world, with the examples of the wonderful developments in India and China of self-sufficiency in food. Then by comparison, we have the deplorable subsidies of the EEC causing overproduction, followed by dumping and disruptive market activities in agricultural products. Unfortunately, the EEC are not alone in these trading barriers and assistance in agriculture, something which deeply affects those who can produce efficiently like Australia. We've been through a minerals boom when it was portrayed that we had eternal wealth to be neatly redistributed to our people, and the proposition presented that manufacturing industries with a high labour content could be dispensed with. Pressure was being placed on us by some of our major overseas customers, saying that if they were to continue to buy our raw materials, then we should at least buy back their finished goods. They claimed our tariffs prevented this, and this has been our catch-22 situation. Much of our industry has developed in the period after the 1939-45 hostilities. Industry was then nurtured, for it was seen to be important for self-sufficiency, to overcome our balance of trade problems by reducing imports. It was seen to be important for defence, important too for the jobs it provided, especially for our growing migration program. Following our war experiences and isolation, we had a real desire for self-sufficiency. Industrial development was admired. The community took pleasure in its growth. One can recall the great excitement when the first Holden came from the production line and the admiring words of the Prime Minister of the day, Mr. J.B. Chifley. Somewhere it all went wrong, perhaps because of our isolation and insulation from the energetic post-war world of Europe, the USA, and later Asia. We lost our ability to compete. In fact, we became grossly inefficient, and we lost our ability to develop new products. We indulged in wasteful and lazy work practices. We began to reward ourselves long before we earned and deserved these rewards, with shorter working weeks, more holidays, accompanied with strident industrial relations and an unproductive, demanding society. In this regard, I was interested to read the recent comments by John Stone, the former head of the Australian Treasury, about Australia's rich resources endowment and the elements needed to shape Australia's future. He said, people can only be as rich as their resources and the productivity with which they use them. He went on to say, and I quote, "It is therefore our failings in productiveness that are at the heart of our relatively poor performance as a nation." It is unfortunate that the preoccupation with the short-lived minerals boom of the late 60s and 70s tended to camouflage the basic problems of manufacturing. The heightened overseas interest in Australia at that time and excitement for our mineral exports had accompanied by an expectation of good times for all in the Australian community. Living standards were expected to continue and get even better without any real extra effort. I do not wish to belittle our mineral companies and developers in any way. One wonders where we would be today without them. They create 40% of our exports and huge royalties to the coffers of our state governments. It was, however, somewhere during this period that we saw labour and labour-related costs begin to spiral in an alarming rate. Our people built up a huge expectancy of higher living standards without regard to contribution, productivity, or cooperative community effort to produce greater wealth, before deciding how it was to be distributed. We are paying today, with our potential decline in living standards, for the short-sighted perspectives of that period. It has now become recognised by some of our leaders that one of the key answers to Australia's serious current trading position and the restoration of our comparative declining living standards lies in the hands of our manufacturing and service industries. The proposition I place before you is that an efficient manufacturing and services industry is vital for the restoration of our economy. I hear daily many glib statements being delivered as to how this can be achieved. Sudden demands for investment and cries of "where are the entrepreneurs" are the orders of the day. Investment and entrepreneurs are required, but this is a too simplistic an answer. To build a business requires dedication, an unusual sensitivity, an all-consuming belief in its future by its leaders and backers, a highly motivated group of people if it is to succeed. Success does not come from one government act, one trade union compromise, one round of lower interest rates. It comes from a whole community attitude. It requires stability over many years if our real business builders are to blossom and lead us into a better economic future. It can only come from bright, dedicated, driving people whom others are prepared to follow and be part of. They have to be determined people and people with a vision. Industrial enterprises are enormously sensitive. In my experience, it does not matter if the enterprise is large or very small. Each needs to be given the right environment in which to grow, given the right nutrients from time to time to encourage growth and health, and given basics to enable them to survive. Incorrect treatment can do lasting harm. We cannot avoid the truth if we're to overcome the problems. Harm has in fact been done. Let me give you some examples of the bruising which Australian industry has or is receiving, to the detriment of growth and productivity. I list them in no particular order. Firstly, the government's duty is to provide a secure, encouraging path, provide efficient services in power, on the docks, transport, interest rates at the same level as other countries, and hopefully charges and costs which are at least comparable with our competitors. One asks, has any one of these ingredients been delivered? Secondly, we have the stream of time-consuming government inquiries into an industry or business generally, which always end up with a change in the rules by which manufacturers and businesses must operate. These inquiries themselves demand extraordinary amounts of time, of business time and energy. It seems to make no difference whether you are making bras or brass bolts, or that you're operating in a very competitive commercial climate. The excessive government interference in the normal functioning of the market, which many of these inquiries represent, have the effect of placing industries in a stop-go, uncertain situation. Even if there are a few years between the stop and the new starting instructions. The result is a sapping of confidence and an inability to plan and invest long-term. Businesses cannot make major investment commitments in these circumstances, particularly if many millions of dollars and security of employment are involved. Years of stability are required before a company can decide whether to build a new plant or risk investment in new technology. I wish to emphasize this point on sensitivity. It is very easy to destroy confidence, and it takes years to restore it. Our prime task today is to reduce our trading deficit, and this means we must acquire the skills, efficiency, and technology to compete in world markets on at least equal terms. Traditionally, we've relied as a nation on our primary and mineral industries to earn the bulk of our export income. However, the reality of world trade today is that rural exports have declined in relative importance. It is unlikely that with the huge world growth in agricultural production and the impossible world trade barriers that these products suffer from, that our hard-working farmers can overcome single-handed our economic problems. Low prices for minerals around the world and the expectations that they will remain unattractive for some years yet makes it difficult to expect the total answer to come from this sector. The recent devaluation will help, but we have many countries also fighting for the export of minerals. Some of these countries are single product economies, dependent on one mineral for their economic wealth. They must preserve their position in exports regardless of price. The standard of living in such countries moves in more or less direct proportion to the value of the mineral concerned. In Australia, we have a levering effect arising from the range of minerals produced. A major priority is to get the current account right. The service and manufacturing industries must therefore play a major role if we are to maintain our standards of living. I have become concerned in recent weeks at the unrealistic expectations being expressed about how we can raise the level of exports of manufactured goods. The immediate task, surely, is to revive our depleted manufacturing sector so that it can at least begin to compete on the Australian market and through import replacement help our sorry balance of payments. To expect the miracle turnaround of manufacturing products to suddenly boost exports by 10 billion and in an instant defeat our problems is venturing into the unreal. I don't think, however, that we should be defeatist, but the cure will take some time. Meanwhile, I take encouragement from those people in the community who are already doing their best to remedy the situation. Some companies, my own included, are working as hard as possible at establishing world markets for their products. This does not mean we're neglecting Australia as an operational base or as a market. It simply means that we're widening our market opportunities and spreading production over a large number of economies. My fundamental thesis is that from a foreign activity by our businessmen, that the real benefits flow back to the Australian community. It is only by being out there in foreign trade that managers experience what world product development, world efficiency, and world selling really means. To these ends, an increasing volume of investment by Australian business is being and must be encouraged to go offshore. Management benefits enormously from simply being in the international markets and the feeling and being amongst world competition. It is the very act of matching your product, comparing your product development, and selling your product overseas that sharpens all your commercial abilities. I wonder then why at this early development stage a government would want to risk killing incentive and development by introducing a foreign tax credit scheme. One would think we're masochists in introducing disincentives for what must be a fundamental aim for our country. I was disturbed the other day when one of our community leaders called businessmen troglodytes. This, I suspect, was born either from frustration from the economy not doing what the particular leader wished, or alternatively trying to blame the business sector for some lack of imagination in not going along with the particular remedies being advocated. I looked at the Oxford Dictionary and found that the word meant unacquainted with the ways of the world. From this definition, the opposite would seem to be true, that it is the manufacturers and businessmen who are actually acquainted with the ways of the world. If the conditions are right, you can be assured that our businessmen and manufacturers will become entrepreneurial and outward-looking. Statements like these are unhelpful when businessmen are trying to resolve and wrestle with its problems. The recent debate in Australia has inevitably led to noises in certain quarters referring to the drying up of investment in Australia itself. Certainly business will only invest if the conditions are right. Confidence is vital. The view of the long-term profitability is absolutely essential. Interestingly, when talking of investment, the opposite is also true. That is, if a business does not keep its plants absolutely up to date with the latest technology in plant, it has virtually taken the decision, however unconscious, to withdraw from the industry. Non-investment inevitably means withdrawal. Therefore, the subject of lack of investment requires some analysis before jumping to quick-fire or knee-jerk conclusions. It is an absolute necessity to keep plants modern for the long haul that is ahead. Organisations I'm associated with are spending more than ever before on new equipment. The recent absence of major new business investment in Australia should be no surprise if we look at the fundamentals. New businesses are the important words. Most of the significant capital expenditure today is in keeping existing factories modern. Buying the latest machinery is expensive, particularly in a currency devalued by 30%. The other large direction for capital expenditure in recent years has been on rationalising industries to enable them to survive. Australia needs something more, much more, to overcome our economic deficiency. One of the key problems is that we are paying ourselves too much and trying to absorb excessive on-costs and structured inefficiencies. You may have heard of all this before, and maybe this in itself is not the real problem. We could possibly afford to pay ourselves as we do and still have the rising living standards and wealth accumulation if only our productivity and efficiency match the costs. The problem is not so much the wages, but poor productivity, ridiculous work practices, and indulgent abuses of the system. For example, there can be no pride in the unusually high level of workers' compensation, which reaches more than 20% of wages in New South Wales. We should ask ourselves why this particular problem is confined to Australia amongst all developed countries. The Institute of Public Affairs says our 1985 inflation rate of 8.2% was almost double that of France, more than double that of America, more than 4 times that of Japan, and 6 times that of West Germany. They are amongst our most important trading partners and competitors. Our wage rates, particularly including on-costs, are well ahead of almost all other nations. The answer is efficiency, efficiency, and efficiency. The cost of moving goods within Australia and from it is a major constraint. There are figures freely available to illustrate that shipping to Australia and from our seaports are vastly more expensive than those which other countries' exporters and manufacturers have to cope with. Years of industrial disruption have made us recognized as an unreliable supplier, and in world markets there are few greater sins. There are other problems that must be tackled before the vital leap forward in international trade and its rewards can be achieved. Our state governments still insist on taxing employment through the regressive payroll tax. Huge weekend penalty rates are crippling the cost structures of many industries, including those which should be producing and using its plant for a 7-day week as other nations do. We work a 38-hour week or less when others work 40 or more. We take more holidays than anyone else. It is particularly noticeable when comparing to dynamic economies like Japan. Finally, amongst advanced countries, we're absorbing some of the highest interest rates in the world, a crippling burden for those wishing to finance new industries. One often asks in this environment why our government increases taxes on business to more than 50% when other countries are reducing theirs. Both the governments of the USA and UK have stated aims of reducing their company tax rates to 35%. One matter has deeply concerned me over the last few years, and that is the takeover syndrome, or psych, which has developed in our country. Our media has almost turned some of the better-known figures into folk heroes. It is to be proven whether the apparent quick money made from takeovers, the apparent building of balance sheets, has achieved anything for industry efficiency. Very few hostile takeovers today have much to do with rationalization and efficiency. We're building a nation of conglomerates, playing with assets, shuffling paper and money, and developing what one businessman called recently a casino mentality. This syndrome is having a number of serious consequences. Companies are making short-term decisions, affecting their long-term business perspective. To be internationally competitive, which we must, you cannot be looking over your shoulder at a takeover threat or thinking short-term. Nor can you devote the proper level of funds to important areas like research and development if you're under pressure to maximize profits. The lesson is that you need people. People are what provide the ideas, the energy, the skills, and the success of any enterprise. If the morale of managements and people in target companies is being demoralized or even paralyzed, this is obviously bad for the business and bad for the economy. The noted American expert on business, Professor Peter Drucker, makes another interesting point in a study just published on the subject. He says that in America, only 3 out of every 10 acquiring companies in a merger or takeover situation do as well 2 years later as they did before the takeover or merger. But the record of companies acquired in hostile takeovers, he says, is uniformly dismal. Drucker concludes that the hostile takeover quite clearly cannot be justified as leading to a more efficient allocation of resources. I believe we're suffering from very inadequate takeover laws. Given a few changes, it would not be difficult for governments to remedy. For example, I believe any bid for more than 30% of a company should be a bid for all the shares, as is done in the UK. The threshold for reporting a substantial interest should be 5%, not 10%, and then be reported for each movement of 1%. As in the UK, escalation clauses should be prohibited. Companies should be able to purchase their own shares under appropriate guidelines. Simple changes like this would restore stability to the Australian corporate scene. The future of Australian industry lies in being international. It is only by being international that business executives understand and meet the real competition from other countries. It's easier to say, become international, than to achieve it. In my own company, we have come to the firm conclusion that going offshore requires any one of the following 3 points, but at least one of the ingredients must be present for success. Firstly, the goods produced or sold must have a distinct technological advantage. Forgive me for mentioning my own company, but that's where my experience lies. Through the dedication of over 30 years of a number of people, we have developed world leadership in latex technology. This was started in Richmond by the Ansell family. Then and now, we build our own machines, develop the manufacturing techniques and product design. And I'm pleased to say that we now have 3 plants in Malaysia, a beautiful new one in Thailand, 5 in the USA, and 1 in Mexico. We proudly claim to be the world's largest producer of medical examination gloves, the world's largest producer of household gloves, and the 2nd largest in the world in surgeon's gloves. With the capacity we're installing, we'll be selling worldwide 1 billion medical examination gloves in a year. We're proud to claim for Australia that we're genuinely a world leader in these products. We hope for similar success with our pulsar car and truck battery. This breakthrough was developed in Sandringham by a few young engineers. The machinery had to be designed and made, the process perfected. It has taken some 10 years of hard work. The first plant, costing $10 million, was recently completed in Geelong. These men are now perfecting the 2nd generation pulsar, called the Never Say Die battery. The name is self-explanatory, as there is always reserved capacity to start your car even if you flatten the battery by leaving your car lights on all night. You can start the car in the morning by the same turn of the ignition key. The battery will then switch across to the main part of the battery, previously made flat, and recharge it as you drive down the road. The Never Say Die battery is being perfected, and the first production plant will be built in Columbus, Georgia, over the next year. We then propose adapting the Geelong plant to follow. These are fascinating examples, I believe, of Australian industrial creativity. The 2nd ingredient, the advantage of a principal brand name. If a company can develop a superb brand name supported by a good product image, success is really rewarding. There are very few examples of this from our shores. It is a hard and long road to develop great international names like Dunlop, Coca-Cola, Adidas, to name a few. The Japanese have been brilliant in recent years with their many household names. They've developed internationally, and some spring to mind: Toyota, Nissan, Sony, Canon, Casio, to name a few. There is one Australian example which has New Zealand overtones, and it is Kiwi, which is well known throughout the world. The 3rd ingredient is economic production and the ability to be the most efficient low-cost producer. This is particularly difficult to develop in Australia, although hopefully an example is steel. Steel, based on all the natural advantages of our raw materials, should be really encouraged to be one of our basic world products. Aluminium, with our raw materials and possible cheap power sources, should be another. But in recent years there have been a number of obstacles in the industry's path to achieve the results confidently predicted a few short years back. One ventures to say that without one of these three ingredients, own technology, brand name, or low-cost producer, the chances of success in making international sales is very slender. I began by suggesting our prime task is to reduce our trading deficit. This means we must develop or acquire the skills, efficiency and technology to compete in world markets on at least equal terms. Manufacturers must be given the incentive to adopt the policies which will enable them to do this with confidence. It will mean taking risks, but that is what much of the deployment of capital and everyday round of business and commercial life is about. The spirit, the flair, and the energy which we have built great enterprises, developed and marketed new products and processes are what we need to encourage. And it must be on a cooperative basis amongst all those contributing to the end result. The right atmosphere, as I have mentioned, is one thing. A genuinely cooperative spirit among all concerned is another. The reality, and there is no getting away from it, as Mr. Charlie Fitzgibbon recently reminded us in a very thoughtful paper to the Economic Planning and Advisory Committee on Industrial Relations, is that nothing has yet been found which replaces self-interest. True, we must take this into account. We must therefore, as he put it, find new ways of rewarding special endeavour. Otherwise we will not create the environment to expect people to make that special effort from our shop floor upwards. Finally, the involvement of this teaching institution. The production and encouragement of well-trained young people is our most important commodity. The country needs trained minds ready to accept the thrill of challenge and the attainment of standards. The thought of mediocrity must be banished. The good enough attitude has been part of our self-destruction as a vital community. We must also look for more entrepreneurial skill and creativity. We must continue the good work being done to train the new generation of managers. We must ensure that we have people who are responsive to the opportunities which the rest of the world offers our enterprises. Our people must be challenged and not deterred. They must know how to harness the commitment of their fellows, providing the energy and the skills, and to develop a common sharing of purpose. Sir Philip Lynch was sensitive to all these needs. He was known well and understood all stratas of our society. I hope for Australia's sake that we can each do something constructive to bring about the cooperation and the understanding needed to achieve them. After all, our living standards are at stake.